Jubilee Circle, and welcome to our presentation this afternoon with Dr. Phil Michels. He will be talking to us about God consciousness and how we can recognize it and cultivate it within ourselves. Just a little bit about Jubilee. If you don't know, I'm Candace Shalou. I am the spiritual director here, and we are a interfaith community here in Columbia, South Carolina. And this is part of our series of learning a little bit more about how other folks view the universe, view God, and some of the spiritual lenses that we get to look through. And we get to look through all different ones here at Jubilee Circle. So Dr. Michels is part of that to give us his perspective on spirituality. And for those of you who are more interested in Jubilee Circle and want to learn a little bit more about us, you can go to jubileecircle.com and learn all about what we're doing and some of the things that we do. We have an open mic where we bring in a lot of local musicians, and we have other educational and fun things going on, including Sounding School on Sunday mornings. I'm so excited about Sounding School. It's just a nice half hour of sound healing before our celebration on Sunday mornings. So please join us for that. Sorry. 6729 Two Notch Road is where we're located here in Columbia, South Carolina. And I want to bring Dr. Michels in and pin this microphone to him and let him take over. I want you to tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and then we will get into your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to give this to you. And I'm going to very well. All right, you can just hang that on your pants.
Yeah, anywhere's good there. Thank you.
There we go.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I guess in terms of background, just a couple words. I have a PhD in clinical psychology. I went to the University of Southern Mississippi and Yale University and taught at the medical school here at the Department of Family Medicine for 20-some years. My heart is clinical psychology, psychotherapy, and I got in the field exclusively to do psychotherapy, and it's quite a story how I got in, because I didn't deserve to get in, and God helped me out from the get-go, and I won't go there with it, but it's quite a story as I reflect on my life now. What I'm going to say is about the talk is that I'm going to summarize for you my life and my spiritual existence. I put a lot of time in putting this together, and it's really about realizing. The talk is about realizing, and so it's a journey of the mind, and I'm going to give you the best I can to summarize my spiritual existence. I was like maybe most of you, fair weather nothing in the spiritual world. My grandma took me to church, and I remember once the preacher came over to pay a visit to my grandmother, and I remember taking him. I had underpants on. I was in the living room, and I lowered my underpants and flicked it with my foot, and it landed right in the face of the preacher. My grandmother put me in the bedroom quickly. I don't know how old I was, maybe 8 or 9. Anyway, I had no meal that night. And I was sort of like that. I'd go to church and I'd sit through, bored as I could be, and that would be it. And I did that per my grandmother for a long time. But I did believe in God, and I had a good indoctrination, despite my recklessness. It really was the Course in Miracles. Oh, and by the way, I want to say this too, that I brought with me, and I'm going to give you folks, through Candace, if I can find it here. Yes. This is a videotape that I made an interview with Bob Miller. As best I know, Bob Miller was the originator of A Course in Miracles here in Columbia, South Carolina. I'm one of the original people that was in the Course in Miracles for some years, and this is a marvelous interview of Bob, if anybody wants some history in terms of our local course. I'm just leaving it, and I'm hoping some of you might take it home. It's about an hour of him talking about the course and himself. He's quite entertaining. He was in his 80s then, and he was very alive, drove a motorcycle like a madman, and very full of energy, which is I felt from Candace and what she was doing here. It's still alive and well in what's going on in the course. So this is here, and I guess Candace decide where to make it available. Okay, I'm going to go ahead now if we can get the slides going. God's gift of consciousness. Okay, we don't have a changer, do we? You'll do it? Okay. We'll start with this quote from the Course. The ego is nothing more than a false belief about our identity. It's a belief that we're separate, alone, and on our own, referencing Candace earlier in her talk. Okay. And then, of course, the prologue. Nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. Okay. This presentation focuses on the world inside us, and it's almost entirely going to go from there. So I'll hopefully be clear enough. Please jump in if I'm not clear, because I want to be clear in what I want to tell you. Go ahead. So we'll start with a brief look back. Next slide. God's miracle in me. This is a true story, and I'll be quick. When I taught in family medicine as a full-timer, what I saw constantly were people with chronic illnesses coming in. Diabetes is a good one. The new doctor typically, be it a medical student or a resident, would say this long panorama of what the person should do. Eat better, get walks, blah, 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 blah. And they'd feel good because they learned all this stuff for 4 years plus. And then the patient come back in 2 months and they'd measure the sugars, and they were as bad or worse, typically. So the new doctor be kind of ticked off, say the spiel again, and then a month or two later, in comes the patient. Same junk. So some doctors got very angry with patients. You can imagine, I mean, one of my things I did for them was run a stress reduction curriculum because they were flipping out. These are A students that get into medical school, and they're lucky to be in the middle of the pack. And many are struggling to stay in medical school, so they're cramming and studying like crazy. They learn all this, and then they see patients, and they get chronically ill people like diabetics, and they find about 80% of the time, these people are not listening too hot. And they're saying, well, I spent 4 years killing myself for what? And so there is what I was seeing, typically, okay? So the word is compliance, and what I wanted to do was find a way to help the doctors reach the patients so they'd be more cooperative and be better health. And what I did was spend 7 years studying compliance. And this is in the 90s, and back then I could get in the libraries on my computer, and I could look in there and find out compliance. I'd look the word, I'd see what's there, and I'd copy them down. And then when I'd have a page of articles, I would go to the library, usually the Cooper one downtown, or the medical school one at the VA. And I would pull the books, find the pages, copy the article, and take them in a little folder of these articles home and read them. And over 3 months or so, I'd be adding some new ones as I looked. And then I'd go for 7 years, maybe 3-4 times a year. I'd leave work at 5. I'd go to the library and I'd pull the books. It'd take almost 6 hours to get them and copy them. There was not one article that I could use to give a talk. almost all of them were what's called publish or perish, people wanting to get publications to get tenure. And so they weren't doing much with what they said, and I didn't get much out of it. It's like I was like an imbecile. I would keep going to the library. It's like going to a well and putting a bucket in there, and up it comes, and it's empty. There's no water in the well. Well, I kept going there for 7 years like that. Then, and here's the point, the miracle in me, in December 1999, I went into the Cooper Library, got the same old rigmarole. I'm going down the steps. I'll never forget this. There's a silver moon, very cool, and a voice in my head said, go back in the library, go to the 3rd floor, look for a big red book on a long table by itself. Copy the article. Right in my head. So, it's 20 to 12. The library's closed at midnight. I ran down to the 3rd floor, and I'm kind of jogging. Almost nobody's there at that hour. Library was not popular, even at the university. So anyway, there it was. Big red book, long table by itself. So first thing I did, copy the call number, the loudspeaker, library's closing in 10 minutes, get your things. I got the call number so I can go back, get the book. Meantime, I flipped it open. There was an article in front of me. Strangest thing, the unbearable automaticity of being was what it was called. Damn, if that didn't sound stiff. It was a scientific review article. And so I thought, hey, Michels, what a treat. Come in, please. Oh, this is a dear friend, a Mayor Baba friend. Oh, what a treat. God bless you. What a nice treat. Michels Wheeling, Dr. Wheeling, another one of them, clinical psychologist. 2 of us now. Okay, so here's how the story played. I copied that article, The Unbearable Automaticity of Being. Didn't know if it was the right one or anything. It just opened it. So I went home, and at about midnight, 12:30 when I got home, and I read the thing while I ate. And I didn't quite get it so good. So I read it a second time. I didn't go to bed that night till 3, but in point of fact, God had given me that clearly, that article to read, and it changed my life. The article was on consciousness. Next slide, please. Now, I started within a week. It hit me again. Start a quit smoking program, and I'm going to be very brief on this. It's ran for 20 years, and it's based on consciousness, which is what this talk is on, okay? Our success rates for these smokers over the 20 years range from 77% a year are smoke-free to 89%, 9 out of 10 quit smoking over the 20 years of the program. And we had medical students calling people for follow-up sometime later to see if they started smoking again. And we found that better than 50% had never smoked again. So those numbers are 400 to 600 times the national averages for quit smoking programs at that time, based on the gift of consciousness. Okay, next slide. So we're going to get started. Go ahead. The world can be hard on us. Next slide. My God, here it comes again. Okay? Today's the first day of the rest of your life. That sounds like the tribulation stuff a little bit earlier maybe there. Does that sound right? Okay. Don't mind me, I'm just returning your nose. I found it in my business again. Okay? How birds see the world. Okay? What's the matter with you? Can't you save that for during the commercials? Okay, we live in an outside world, a world of chaos. Okay? We also live in an inside world, God's kingdom. Here, involved is our mind and the Holy Spirit. For who among men know the thoughts of a man except man's spirit within him? That's a quote from Paul. I'm fond of him, as you heard earlier. Remember, peace is more important than justice. Okay, let's go ahead. Another quote, this one's from Christ, and I'm going to, by the way, be weaving some of what's in the Bible with what's in the Course in Miracles. I think the author, being Christ, is quite apt. Yes, and somebody did a quote from Matthew from the Bible earlier, yeah. So here's one from Luke. A Pharisee asked Jesus when the kingdom of God would come. Jesus replied, "The kingdom of God does not come with careful observation, nor will people say, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is,' because the kingdom of God is within you," as is very clear in the Course. And here it is in the Bible from Christ himself. The kingdom of God is within you. Okay, next slide. So let's take a look at the two worlds now. There are two, as I'm seeing it clearly. There's the outside world of chaos, as in the slide earlier. Outside you, it's in time, always changing, and unpredictable. That is the world outside of us. We don't know what tomorrow's going to bring. We have an idea, but may or may not. And it always changes, and it's in time. God's world, the world inside you, it's not dependent on time. It does not change. And it's predictable. In fact, wisdom is the same 3,000 years ago as it is now. God's world does not change. It's out of time. It's away from time. So, that's a huge difference in the two worlds. And we'll try to explore that more now in this talk. Let's go ahead. The life within you. Let's go. Two parts of consciousness. Your thoughts and you, the thinker. And we'll divide a fair bit of this talk into two categories. Next slide. Your thoughts, and now I'm going to do a little cognitive therapy, as some of us are quite familiar with, and then some of you may be familiar with too, hopefully. We'll just do a quick review here. All right. What people believe is true for them. I cannot state that too strongly. It's often a passive thing. People react because they think they know something, and now all of a sudden, it's reality. What you believe is true for you. Okay, let's go ahead. Cognitive therapy. It goes like this. Albert Ellis, I guess. Yes, we talked about that earlier, Justin and I a little. He brought him up. I remember doing some putting things on tables for Albert Ellis at a conference once, and he was grumpy as all get out. Anyway, it based as follows. There's an outside event, and then you have thoughts on it, and then you have feelings based on your thoughts, and finally, you often take actions based on how you're feeling and thinking. Hey, Faust. Hey, what a treat. There. All right. This is another original from the course from many years ago, Faust Paluzzi and a dear friend. Okay, let's continue here. So that's cognitive therapy, and we often react quickly to things and don't stop to consider. Go ahead. Yeah, it's why I'm lingering. Okay. The problem is that we often see one view and buy into it as the only truth. And what happens when we get into debates, maybe initially we could say that Candace had bought into her initial response to the tribulation. And then she was getting very caught up in the wrong, and the sisters were getting very caught up in the right. They were locked in two different views. Okay? So the problem is that sometimes we get into one view and see it as the only truth. What I discover in God's world is there are many ways to see things, and therefore there are many truths in terms of perspective. And we'll continue in that in a bit. Go ahead. What you see reflects your thinking, and your thinking but reflects the choice of what you can see. This is from Course in Miracles. That's another way of saying what I'm saying, but it is a profoundly meaningful point. If you look at the method of life, or to put it another way, if you look at your life and how you live it, this is core stuff, because this is how we live. This is what we live. Our minds, and I say again, life is lived in the mind. Then what we think directs how we feel, and often what we do, and we're living that life, that life. Our bodies are going through the motions of that life in the mind. Okay, go ahead. For example, cognitive therapy again. You speak to somebody mad at you. Let's say somebody comes up to me, first visit in therapy, and after 20 minutes, a strong younger man stands up and says, "Boy, you're a jerk. I never had any kind of therapy as bad as you're giving. You don't know what you're talking about. You need to get out. You're absolutely a loser. I've driven over here. You wasted my time." Okay, there's the trigger, the event, starting place. If I think to myself, who the hell does he think he is? I don't have to take that crap from any patient. I'm going to call the cops and bounce him out of here. If I think like that, I'll get angry. Maybe bounce him out. Or I might think, dog, has he got my number? He's only been here 20 minutes. Man, how's he get so bright? You know, I think about my life in gym class when I was young. I never could hit a softball. They always laughed at me. And then I'd ask girls out in high school, and they'd walk away smirking. And my grades never amounted to much. I never got much done. He's right. I'm going to let him go home early. Maybe I'll lay on the couch in his place for a while. If I think like that, I'll get sad and maybe lay down. Or I might get scared. I might be anxious and say, gee, he's ticked at me. And he's young and strong. I hope he's not going to swing at me. If I think like that, I'll probably try to find a way to calm him down. So next slide, sort of the same. You might think, how dare you? You've no right. I've never been much. He's right. Or further, I hope he didn't take a swing at me, or I need to calm him down. You can think any number of ways is the point. But how you think is going to affect how you feel. And how you feel is going to affect what you're probably going to do. It's in the mind. It's inside you. Okay, next slide. So, a summary, you could think any one of these ways and maybe other ways too. Go ahead. And we're back to this. We got the man in my example bad-mouthing the doctor, and then I have feelings and actions. Next slide. There are many ways to see things, and each view may be true. Go ahead. What you believe becomes your reality. Now comment on believing. Believing brings an idea to you. It makes it real. It strengthens it in you. So when you believe something, it's stronger than having a thought. It's giving it power. Go ahead. But we rarely notice the thoughts we have about an upsetting event. What I see consistently in therapy are people getting mad over the outside event and getting all locked up in what's wrong with it, rather than noticing the thoughts they're having, the meanings they're giving about what's upsetting them, the event out there. They're not doing both. They're doing this constant, this was wrong out here. And people live like that predominantly. Okay, go ahead. So which is more upsetting, the triggering outside event or your thoughts about it? In this case, this angry man. That's right. Generally, that's right. Not always, but it's almost always true. Your thoughts about what's upsetting you, more important than the upsetting event itself. Okay, next thought. Next slide. Okay, so staying upset now. This is a key slide for coping with reality. Staying upset. You can notice trouble. Notice, keep your mind on what upset you, the trigger, the event out here. And you can stay focused on it. The longer you stay on the trouble, the more upset you get. The point is, the longer you stay on it in your mind, the more accountable you are for being upset. Go ahead. So dwelling on an upset. Next slide. That's what happens when you dwell on an upset. You're thinking about it and maybe adding more thoughts that are upsetting you about it. So you're intensifying your own upset. You're doing that. Okay, next slide. How do most influence our lives? Let's take a look at it, adjusting to this better. Next slide. You are mostly responsible for how you feel, and the group had a consensus on this. That is correct. I've done nothing wrong. I need to see my part and fix it. Yes, indeed. See, when everybody was working around here today, cleaning up. That's it. Okay, next slide. If you can't change a situation, change your mind. Now, who can stop you from changing your mind? Another situation. Well, that's worth some thought. If you can't change a situation, change your mind. Next slide. Change your thoughts and begin to feel better. Okay? God's gift of consciousness. God gives us far more ability than we realize to better access God's blessings. I think that's profoundly true. It's within you. It's always accessible. Next slide. So now we're going to go into the second part. We dealt with thoughts. Now we're going to deal with you, the thinker. Next slide. Reality is created by the mind. We can change our reality by changing our mind. Next slide. But the Counselor, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, will teach you all things and will remind you of everything I've said to you. This is very much coming out of Christ, but it's coming out of the Course and the Bible. It's a quote that's consistent. Go ahead. When does the mind stop and the spirit begin? It's an eternal question. Next slide. From the Course, a sense of separation from God is the only lack you really need to correct. And I guess what I'm saying is, the more within you you can be accountable for, the more you're correcting the lack of being separate from God. Next slide. So we've got outside reality and inside reality. Let's look at that for a moment. Outside reality, the brain. We know with technological advances, which are profound and continue to be, that we can measure to a large extent activity in the brain. In a simple descriptive way, we can see a portion of the brain light up, and we would say with certainty there's activity in the brain. We can see that. The brain and the mind are related. They're connected. They're correlated. There's no question about it. You take a chunk out of a brain, and the thinking of the person is significantly affected. They're related. However, they're also distinct. The brain and the mind are distinct. For instance, there is not a human being alive that can tell me what I'm thinking right now. Well, okay, with the exception of myself. Hey, girl. Thomasina. Hello. It's another original from the Course in Miracles. What a treat. Hey, what a treat. Okay. Yeah, they started a little early on me. So the brain and the mind are related, and but they're not the same. For instance, other than me, nobody can tell me what I'm thinking right now. None of you know what's in my mind. Now, the whole presentation is based on my mind in the sense that what I think directs how I feel, which directs how I act and live. That is distinct from the brain, which is purely physical. Okay? Is everybody with me? It's a very big point, because a lot of people who are atheists, let's say, will claim that the only thing real is physical. And I find that patently absurd, because what drives us is often within ourselves, within our thoughts, you as a thinker, and so forth, which they cannot measure. Okay, so the brain and the mind are important distinctions. Go ahead. You can always change back to your accountability to yourself when you're feeling bad. There's an accountability to you that's involved here. Next slide. To change your thoughts, you have to be aware of them. That's not always easy because we're reacting so often. Where people have the most trouble is in that they live out here and everything is a reaction to what's out here. They think too quick, they respond too quick, and they often don't reflect. As a result, they keep reacting. And when you live like that, you're guaranteed trouble. And most people tend to do that. Most people will say they're conscious when they wake up in the morning and their eyes open. They'll say, well, I'm not sleeping now, I'm conscious. Well, That's actually not true. I mean, they're a little more conscious, but people live reacting, and they're not accountable for the meanings they're giving what's happening to them. So consequently, it's always this is what's wrong. Out here. And when you live like that, you get in trouble, because out here is chaos. Go ahead. Maybe something to that, yeah. Maybe something to that. So it's clear that we're made in the image of God. That comes out of the Old Testament, the New Testament, 3,000 plus years. It doesn't change again. In God's world, things don't change. So you, the thinker, versus you. Let's go ahead. Consciousness brings us into the light. Next slide. Why is consciousness a gift from God? I can explain that, I think. This came to me somewhere some years ago. Go ahead. Why is it God's gift? Consciousness. It's a different kind of thinking. Are you with me? It's not reacting to what you're seeing and hearing and smelling. Consciousness is more, and we'll get that further in a minute. It's a gift of God, consciousness, because you can use it anywhere. You can use it anytime. It's free. There's no cost to using it. There's no money involved here. No one can stop you except you. You can stop you from thinking consciously, but nobody else can. And finally, why is it a gift of God? Because it works. God has given us all the gift of consciousness. It's free, always available, anytime, anywhere. Only you can stop you, and it works. Yeah, that's going to wake us up. It's we'll call that an exclamation point in the talk. That was kind of nice. I think it was worth an exclamation point. Okay, so God's gift of consciousness, we all have it within us. And it's available whenever we want to use it, and it works, okay? Next slide. So there are two parts of consciousness. Again, your thoughts and you, the thinker. Let's go ahead. You, the thinker. To be the thinker, there are two important components. I've been sort of saying it, but let's be clear. For you to be the thinker, you have to be aware of the outside situation, which people are triggers. We're reacting. We can do that. You're aware of outside situations and, underline and, aware of your thoughts about it. When you can do both, the obvious that everybody can do, and then what you're doing with what you're seeing and hearing and smelling, what you're doing with it. Now you're the thinker. Go ahead. You, the thinker, are always, and that's a strong word, almost nobody uses it, and I don't think I use it much, but I'm going to use it here. You, the thinker, are always stronger than your thoughts. You're always stronger than your thoughts. Go ahead. Too often, we become our upsetting thoughts. That's a key point. Now let's look at that. We'll take the example earlier with Candace and her initial response to her sisters. She had any number of thoughts of how they were wrong. I can't recall them all, but she listed 5 or 6 things that made this absurd, this tribulation stuff. So each time she had a thought, it bothered her. She has another thought, she's bothered. A third, she's bothered more. It goes on, and when you're in your thoughts, you can build a whole lot of angst. But I just gave you the slide. You, the thinker, are always stronger than your thoughts. So, when you can step back, as she was doing some in her revision of her comments to her sisters, you're now the thinker. And she discussed coarse thinking and the importance of love and other things. Now she's detached, and she's not in the middle of the thoughts anymore. People get in big trouble when they're in the middle of the thoughts because they add to angst, they add to upset. So too often we become our upsetting thoughts. Next slide. When aware of your thoughts, you're not trapped in them anymore. You can think your way out of them. You can change your mind. Next slide. How to become more the thinker, not trapped in your thoughts. All right, that's where we're going now. Next slide. Succinct summary. Be in the world, do not be of it. I'm going to compliment my dear friend Faust, who is, I'll say, as good as anybody I know at being in the world but not of it. He detaches routinely, and his consciousness is quite impressive. But that's it. Be in the world, don't be of it. Next slide. So detachment is a key piece of doing this. You step back and you watch your thoughts. You step back and you watch your thoughts. When you can get into doing this with comfort, you're in God's world. Because now you're seeing your role in your level of upset. You're providing meaning to the things you're seeing out here. And both are important, the things themselves and what you make of them, the meaning you give them. So detachment in watching your thoughts is a key piece of you, the thinker. Next slide. And it brings perspective. Less emotion controls you. Next slide. Quiet is the language of the Holy Spirit, a tribute to Mayor Baba, per Manhel, myself, and whoever else is familiar with Mayor Baba. Things that are real are sent and received in silence. That's a Baba quote. And when you step back and you watch your thoughts, you're in a state of silence, you're in God's world. And from there, you start having control over your circumstances. Every time, it's a big step. Next slide. Another good quote from Albert Einstein. It's not that I'm so smart, it's just that I stay with problems longer. It's the strength of Michels. She used to be my mentor. We worked together for a while, and boy, she was good at that. She'd look at something and she'd sit with it, and then when she'd get ready to write, she was on. That's what he did. He says it. He says, not that I'm so smart. It's just that I stay on problems longer. What is he doing? He's detaching, staying back, and tuning in. There it is. God's world of consciousness. Next slide. When you're more aware, you have more choice, better decisions, more freedom. Those are pretty big things, aren't they? Duration's important. This is a little practical comment. If you're really pretty upset, it's kind of good to remove those troubling thoughts. Get your mind off it. Distraction. Don't stay on something bother you when you're really upset, because it's hard to think clear. It's hard to be conscious, objective. You get upset and you get too upset. Time out. Turn on the TV, put on some music, walk and keep your mind off what's bothering you. Get your mind away from it. Duration's a very important factor. The longer you stay on something bothering you, guaranteed you'll get more upset. So if you're getting too emotional, it's smart to time out. Not to stay timed out, but maybe the next day when you're cool, go at it again, look at it again. When you're too hyped up emotionally, duration's important. Keep it in mind. Next step. If the emotion stays strong, as I say, go back and look at it again when you're cool. Often a day later is a good move. Next slide. Timeless truth. This is coming off of, again, one's accountability to yourself. Where's the enemy? I've only 3 enemies. My favorite, the one most easily influenced for the better, is the British Empire. My second enemy, the Indian people, far more difficult. But my most formidable opponent is a man named Mohandas Gandhi. With him, I seem to have very little influence. This is the story of life. This ain't just him. This kind of all of us. And it's the heart of the slides. And then this goes back to the 30s, a cartoon that always sort of says the same. We have met the enemy, and he is us. That's right. Next slide. Okay, so the process of gradual change. I warn you, this is a thick talk. I'm giving you a lot of things, but you'll take and pick what's best for you. Next slide. In terms of change now, and this is a very practical issue here, how do you change durably is what I'm getting into now. Everything begins with words and thoughts. Starting place for everybody. Then, next slide, come ideas. A good idea is necessary. It's an important step. We need to have good ideas. However, ideas are weak. And what happens is that most people will get a good idea and say, I'm going to do that. That's great. New Year's resolutions. Do you know that 95% of the time they don't stick? When I gave you the information on diabetes and people making changes for their lives, their health, about 80% of them don't substantially. So good ideas are an important start, but in and of themselves, they're weak and useless. They won't work. They're too weak of the mind. Next slide. Next slide. So what you need to do is to take a good idea and make it meaningful, and we'll look at that briefly. Next slide. Making meaningful. You watch your thoughts. Maybe you ask questions as thoughts come to you. See what answers you get. Now we're in silence. Bob's comment. You'll get answers to your own questions, and you're playing with it, so you're starting to make more of the idea itself. You're making it meaningful. And that step now has some power to have more durability for whatever it is you're working on. You see your answers, you think about your answers, and then your answers lead to even more questions. And you could do this 5 minutes, and then maybe 5 hours later, sit it for another 5 minutes and ask some more questions. And over days, what you're doing is staying on it longer, Einstein's comment. And when you do that, you're starting to make more meaningful whatever it is that was a good idea to begin with. You're making it meaningful. You're increasing the durability of it changing you. Go ahead. to make a change last, make your thoughts more meaningful, and finally, realize the meaning. Next slide. Realize the meaning. All right. This is a Paul quote. Don't conform to this world. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. That's it. Next slide. To realize meaning takes time. Next slide. We begin with words and thoughts, then come ideas which are weak. Make ideas meaningful. Learn to be more conscious. Sit quiet, ask questions. Let your answers lead to questions. And then realize the meaning, reflect, build meaning over time. Next slide, I'm going to give you an example of realizing. It's the best way I know how to get this. It's the final step. Words, thoughts, ideas, make them meaningful, realize the meaning. When you realize a meaning, you're different. When you realize a meaning, you're not the same person. You will act a little different in terms of what you've realized. Now, I'm going to give you an example of it here. I think this will make sense to you. I'm giving you one that everybody knows, I think. Go ahead. The wilderness journey from the book of Exodus in the Bible. You remember this was the journey where God took them out of Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea, and then they're in this wilderness. We all know the story. Okay. Well, let's realize the story. Now, I've read this story or heard this story maybe 7 or 8, 10 times. I don't know. But all I could do if somebody asked me about it, I can give you the storyline. I could have said that maybe the second time I heard it. So the next 7 times was useless, waste of time, because I'm getting nothing out of it beyond the summary of the story, which is not what it's in the Bible for. So let's look at the realizing piece. Next slide. Okay, so I've just said that. How did these people who were forced into the desert, of course at the time they were grateful to be out of Egypt. Didn't last long though, did it, their gratefulness. Let's go ahead. From the Course in Miracles again, all fear is ultimately reducible to the basic misperception that you have the ability to usurp the power of God. Fear is reducible to the absurdity that you have the power to usurp the power of God. Isn't that true? Well, I'm going to operationalize how true it is in this story, because God took them out of the world. God took them out of the world. They're in the desert where no humans are. He took them out of the world. Go ahead. And what are they saying? They're in the desert now. What are they saying? They're saying what they're thinking. And what are they thinking? Sand everywhere. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I'm glad you did that. So let's repeat the slide here. What do the people do? It's in their minds now. They're there and they're thinking. And then they're sharing their thoughts, and so it's becoming contagious. The vast majority are thinking, sand every daggone place. Oh, same food every day. we're bored. Where do we do? What's there to do? Nowhere to go. Everywhere you look, it's just sand everywhere. And we should do things that are some interest. Okay, and within themselves, one of the major points of God's world is that these people were not aware of what their thoughts did to them. They were not aware of what their thoughts did to them. This life I'm in is not my fault. God's to blame. He put us here. Sand, same food. I'm sick of it. Their thoughts. Go ahead. So God's world, now He took them out of the world and He put them there. Their perceptions are right. Back to perception. However, they were not accountable for their thoughts. And what is God telling them to do there? This. Don't worship other gods. Don't lie. Don't steal. Don't covet your neighbor's goods. Honor your dad and mom. Don't commit adultery. Don't commit murder. He's telling them how to live. And if this talk is anything, it's a talk on how to live. So that's what He told them to do in the desert. Next slide. So, what did they do? They brought the old world with them into the desert. So, they're worshiping false gods, whatever it might be, somebody's shawl or somebody's moccasins or whatever, lying. No, I don't want to admit I'm doing wrong. Maybe I can get ahead by lying. They brought the old world with them in their minds, and then as a collective group, they potentiated it. They stole, they murdered, there was adultery. They're not accountable. Look at some of this. Steal, murder. What about your conscience? If you're stealing and murdering, you're probably not thinking about what's going to happen inside of you. Same point, they're not accountable for their thoughts. Same thing here with adultery. Don't you have to lie to cover it up? Discontent, what about that? Well, if all you're thinking about is that attractive person you're having an affair with, the rest of it doesn't have to mean anything. Next slide. So, the people created this world. Next slide. We take our wandering thoughts, gently bring them back to where they fall in line with all the thoughts we share with God. Again, a quote from the text in the course telling us how to live. Take your thoughts and bring them back to the thoughts with God. In the story, had they listened to God, God's thoughts told them the commandments. Had they done that, they would have had a different life. Next slide. Had they been accountable to themselves for the thoughts that controlled their lives, then there would have been more love for one another, no selfish investments, families treated well, no murders, lying, cheating, no need to hide things. Life would have been different. Now, granted, it would have been gradual because they have to change the way they lived, and they're coming blind into the desert. But if they'd have tried to obey God, it would have been hit and miss at first because it's kind of new. But if they'd have kept devoting to it gradually, this would have been happening. And if this happened, then what? Next slide. They would have been in paradise. And they would have gradually gotten there because they'd have been accountable to themselves for what thoughts they were having. Next slide. But all they saw was sand. Why is the world so hard? The world will always be a terrible place. Or, life is so hard because we think in the same reactive way, quick, not conscious. We still see too much sand. Next slide. God is, and this is a quote from Bob Miller, the videotape I'm leaving here. Bob, I think the founder of the local Course in Miracles group, said God is life, love, light, spirit, truth. All definitions of God. Take a look at them. Next slide. This is Mother or Sister Teresa, however you prefer. If we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten that we belong to each other. Treat thy neighbor as thyself, a journey of the mind. That's it.
All right, we want to thank Dr. Michels for being here at Jubilee Circle, and we thank you for watching the video. And if you want more information about Jubilee Circle, it's jubileecircle.com. If they want more information about you, Dr. Michels, how can folks reach you?
Well,
come over here.
I'm always interested in giving this talk. It's of course free, but I'm feeling God has led me to want to give this more to more people. So I'll give my phone number, and if anybody thinks there might be a group that might like to hear it, please feel free to call me. My number is 803-237-4239. And I might be a day or so getting back to you, but I call you and we'll find a way to do the talk wherever